Hello and welcome to the Digital Leaders Show, where our goal each week is to discuss key issues and news at the intersection of business, technology, and the humanities in hopes of making you a better digital leader as we all transform to digital enterprises in a fully digital society. This week, we're discussing headlines from our DEI Weekly. It's a curated selection of our favorite content for global digital leaders. It goes out to members each week, and you can sign up at DEInetwork.com. This week, we're focusing on the long-term effects of layoffs, the big banks' hold on the U.S. consumer, and social media fights heating up in the area of security as well as news. We're live each Wednesday, noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, 6 Central European Time on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And the audio recording is available on major podcast platforms the following week. Check out our resources, DEIresearch.com, where you can find all of our digital transformation research, or to learn more about us or some of the custom research projects that we can do, go to DEInetwork.com. I'm Dan Goodstein. I head up the Digital Enterprise Institute and the Institute for Robotic Process Automation and Artificial Intelligence. We're a professional association and peer-to-peer research network providing education, networking, advice to over 130 executives globally, all around automation, AI, and digital transformation. My co-host is Carlos Alvarenga. He's a researcher and author, an educator at the University of Maryland and Georgetown University, and former advisor with EY and Accenture. Carlos, good afternoon.
Yeah, good to see you for our final show of 2022.
It's the final one, right? We're going to take a couple weeks break after this, and hopefully everybody else will too, and enjoy family and holidays and all that stuff. But we've had a really good run over the last several weeks. Lots of hot news in the tech space, and we've gotten a lot of really good feedback on the conversations here, Carlos.
It's been interesting. A lot of things we talked about sort of played out the way we thought they would, right? Just looking this morning at the latest FTX news, and when we first heard about it, it seemed to us that it was just good old-fashioned fraud, right? Classic. And it seems that the more that comes out, that's kind of where we're headed, right? A recurring theme on the show has been this issue of sort of privacy, for example, right in the tech world. I think the latest news from TikTok and a few other places continues to keep that at the forefront. And yeah, the debate about free speech as well, right, continues to evolve. So all topics that I'm sure will continue to 2023, no doubt.
Yeah. A few weeks ago, I joked around about us predicting the future, and then we come on the following. The benefit of doing a weekly show, I guess, we come on the following week, and some of the moves with Apple and China, and like you say, the privacy and some of the content stuff. I want to talk to you about some of this big news in kind of the world of tech and social media and journalism that we've been talking about. We had a great conversation last week with our guest, Jason Steinhauer, the best-selling author who wrote History Disrupted, How Social Media and the World Wide Web Have Changed the Past, and more evidence of that, and more of that kind of battle kind of heating up this week, Carlos. But before we jump into that, I'm just curious as to what other topics kind of caught your mind in digital transformation news this week.
I think the article that I enjoyed the most was the one about the breakthroughs of 2022, and two really jumped out at me, right? And one was this generative AI conversation and the rapid pace at which that technology seems to be accelerating. I make my life writing, and so my livelihood writing, so that a machine can suddenly write. And is that an aid to me, right, or a replacement for what I do? I find a very interesting conversation. And then there was an article about sort of the creation of sort of synthetic embryos, right, mouse embryos for the first time, and they were made from stem cells. So it's the first time that someone was able to create an embryo organism, right, of a species and have it develop. And I've said in the past that I think in the future we will be able to grow human babies, right, in the lab. And if it ever happens, it seemed to me like this was almost like the very, very origin kind of that process sort of first come to life. And then, of course, just in the last week, right, we've seen this announcement from Livermore about fusion. The first time there's ever been a fusion reaction that produced more energy than they consumed.
Crazy.
And if you read the articles about it, right, the people in that world consider it to be one of the greatest accomplishments kind of in physics probably in the last 20, 30 years. So it's a very provocative set of innovations this year. I think more so than in the recent past that have been kind of dominated by COVID, right? And I think this was the year we saw a lot of new ideas that were not sort of pandemic related. So lots
Yeah,
of
the one that jumped out to me, is this piece from Harvard Business Review about what companies are getting wrong, with these layoffs, and like, obviously you can't watch any news, whether it's social media news or traditional media news, without seeing some of the cuts that are happening. Morgan Stanley.
Jerome Powell has his way. There's more to come, right? The Fed
And
is
there's more to come. Yeah, I mean, Pepsi's talking about cutting hundreds of jobs. Morgan Stanley cut 2% of its workforce. Even the big tech firms, right? Redfin 13%, Lyft 13%, Stripe 14%, Snap 20%, Meta 13, Twitter 50. We've talked about that. So it seems like no industry is immune to it, including, but maybe especially of the tech space. But what's interesting is this article kind of cites a bunch of different research from several years till now about really the long-term effects of these layoffs, and basically what he's saying is that he's making the case that the short-term savings that are provided by these layoffs are really overshadowed by a bunch of other factors that actually may play more into the ultimate profitability of the company.
Mhm. It's a debate that goes way back, right? There was a book that came out a long time ago called The Loyalty Effect. And the thesis of the author was that companies decided to zero out the value of loyalty in the balance sheet. And so when they began to first sort of just throw people out the door kind of at will, it was made on the conclusion that the fact that an employee was loyal to you because you didn't lay them off, right? In times that at the big corporate sort of world, whether they came from consultants or HR executives, the decision was made that that wasn't really that important. And the author made the case that was a huge mistake. That the loyalty of an employee to a company it's a major intangible asset like brand is, and that it had been really incorrectly undervalued. And I think this article sort of goes back to the same point made years ago by in the book The Loyalty Effect. I think it's the same thing again, that you lose much more than you gain. It may not seem that way because it's difficult to quantify, right, what it is that you're giving up, and the cost savings on the HR sort of ledger are pretty easy to look at. But there's a strong argument to be made, right, that are you really factoring in all the costs that are there? And I always make the distinction between financial costs and economic costs, right? And financial costs are present and accounted for. Economic costs are present but not accounted for yet. But that doesn't mean they won't be in the future. And I think this is another example of an economic cost that companies assume isn't there, but it is there. And they only focus on the financial cost, which is visible, but the economic cost is not.
Listen, I'm a marketer, as you know. Marketing is always a difficult thing to measure, right? But what you do know is that these companies spend millions and millions of dollars. We talked about influencer marketing a couple weeks ago. Millions and millions of dollars in advertising and marketing, largely around brand and brand image, and we've talked about the personification of brand, but the reputation collateral damage that happens as a result. And one of the things he cites is that news travels a lot faster
Yeah,
today than it did 50 years ago, right? And so what's that reputational cost? What's that PR cost? And then he also talks about just that's tough to quantify, but even in the short term, what you can quantify is the effect on the market and the stock price. I mean, if the stock price tanks as a result of these moves, then you just lost your cost savings in 72 hours, never mind the long-term effects.
I think that and the fact that we all those of us who've worked for a while know there's a huge difference in working in a company where you think this job could disappear at any moment because this is the way the company is run, right? And that from a company where you say, look, if there are tough times, everything humanly possible will be done to keep this team intact, even through a difficult period. The way you think about the company, the way you think about your job, the way you think about the investments you're willing to make, how often your eye is on right job boards outside the company, or you're taking calls from recruiters. All these things are different depending on the environment in which you work. And I think that once you sort of flip the switch and tell everybody, listen, if at taking given the right circumstances, right, you're out the door too. Maybe not this time, but it could be the round two or round three. All kinds of behaviors of the people who remain are altered, right? And I think that cause isn't really well understood. Although this article does a nice job of laying that out. You've got all these ramifications, right, that flow through the business in terms of innovation, retention, et cetera, that are additional costs that weren't factored in many cases when the decision to lay off any number of people was made.
Especially when, and I've said this, on this show and elsewhere, if as we evolve to a world where customer experience becomes the biggest differentiator,
Right.
think about the law. Think about the issues around the customers who the employees that are customer facing, or the lack of customer experience that's happening. They're not able to quantify that cost yet, but what's the cost of that, right? Because these companies, you lose customer loyalty a lot quicker today than you did also 50 years ago. And you bring up a really interesting one as well, which is innovation. Obviously, to bring this back down to the tech world that we're in here, that our audience is in. What you lose is innovation, and you have a knowledge loss, right? There's a huge issue in automation and AI, and any company that's doing R&D, right? If you have high turnover, aside from the fact that you're not advancing and focusing on R&D and innovation, you're also going backwards. You're losing a lot of what you've already built through that turnover.
And we've talked about this before, though, because this is a show about leadership. I brought up the fact that I've worked for two kinds of leaders, right? One is the kind of person who I've heard people scream, right, on a partner call. If you can't get the job done, someone else will be on this call next week, right? That leadership style where it is presented as completely transactional and numerically driven, which wasn't even always the case, but that was the persona, right, that was presented to us as leaders in the company. I can tell you that in that environment, you start thinking transactionally too. You don't think about innovation. You don't think about what chance could I take, because what's been said to you is you better deliver the number every quarter, right, or you're out the door in 24 hours. In that frame of mind, where's innovation going to enter the picture? Right? Your first job is to keep this transactional boss happy and screaming at someone else on the call instead of you. Different from a boss, not who is going to say, hey, whatever happens, you're fine, but who understand there's a process that we're going to go through. Should it ever get to the point where you need to, have a different role, it's not going to be a knee-jerk reaction to one bad quarter, right? And in that environment, you might innovate. You might come to that boss and say, listen, I know this is a challenge, but what about this idea? I think that once you go down this road of, listen, we're having a bad quarter, so you all have to leave, then there are all kinds, it's invisible dominoes, I call it, right? You tipped one domino, but there was a whole bunch behind that you're not going to see. And very few of those are good for the business.
And what's it going to take to make up that opportunity cost, right? So the punchline of the article, for me was, according to the research, the firms that conducted layoffs underperformed firms that did not, with comparable performance. So the downsizing companies really lost their competitive advantage to their competitors, and took them a lot longer to kind of come out of it.
And yeah, look, we both know there are two kinds of layoffs, right? There's existential. Look, the business has got a real problem and we just can't sustain workforce level X. But most of the time in companies, that's not the case, right? Nobody's laying off because they're going broke. They're going off because EPS is going to take a hit or whatever. And CEO numbers are not going to look good that quarter and the board's not going to be happy. That's why these people are let go. And everybody knows that. So to be let go because there's no other way to keep the business sustainable is one thing. To be let go because you don't want to have a bad earnings call, all right, that doesn't go down well with anybody, whether you're the one who leaves or whether you're the ones that stay, in my experience.
So apparently the only ones that are not struggling in all of this, Carlos, although some of them are still doing layoffs, seemingly are the banks. There was also an article this week. I think it was a Wall Street, based on a Wall Street Journal article that was talking about the trend of people moving away from institutional banks to more of these fintech type of banks, like they've done in other industries. Hasn't really happened the same way in banking. Americans, for whatever reason, and there's a couple thoughts in this piece, but are just not kind of ditching the big institutional, big brand banks, even though some of the others are offering more convenience theoretically, and higher interest rates and things like that. What's your take?
Well, I think it's a psychological thing. Most people have a very personal relationship with their money, and so giving it to a nice, solid institution that who everyone trusts is one thing. Giving it to an app, right? Again, especially after what happened in recent months with some of the apps, becomes problematic. And I think for the majority of people, there's still this psychological fact of uh, walking into a building that looks solid, right? And it's a name that you know. And so where maybe it's a generational shift. And maybe if you're 15 and you grow up with the idea that your money goes into an app, right? Then that's one thing. But for most people, there's still this emotional connection with the physicality, right, of the traditional banking world that still reassures individuals that this is the place where the money should be.
It's definitely somewhat generational, but you bring up a really good point, which is, even though it's not exactly the same thing to the common public, I think this FTX thing hurts, right? Because again, it
Yeah,
was
right.
an
Mhm.
exchange, right? It wasn't meant to be an investment in that way. It was meant to be a place where you could kind of,
And
park
if,
your
and if
money.
you don't follow finance closely, the information investment, the time that's required to say, well, this is this one of those apps that's okay versus an FTX 2.0, it just isn't worth it when you can go to Wells Fargo or Citibank and know that they're not going to disappear tomorrow, at least not in your mind, conceivably they won't, right? Because none of them have. Even in the worst of cases, the last time we had big banks go away was back in, I guess, 80s S&L crisis. Since then, whatever happens, they get fined. They have problem A or problem B. They may close your branch, but they're not going anywhere. As we saw with FTX, the whole thing disappeared, right? $30 billion gone in 48 hours. That's not a recipe for building confidence in the next generation of financial right applications. I think the FTX thing again, right, is reverberating throughout all of finance because it's not just about FTX. It's the idea that this thing was supposed to be safe. There was supposed to be $1 of asset for every dollar of deposits. It just wasn't. So yeah, I think this is most, and I think the article made the point that there is still a psychological benefit, and I liken it to education. I could I could make a college that is just as good and just as effective as an Ivy League school and make it all digital. There's still going to be some psychological value to walking around campus, right, and seeing ivy covered halls and students and that entire setting. It's a kind of educational theater, right, to some extent. And we might say think about banks. There's a kind of financial theater that goes on, and it reassures the average consumer.
So the big topic for this week is really, and it's fitting. It's that this is the last show we're doing for the year because it really kind of summarizes a bunch of stuff that we've been talking about, right? So as I mentioned, we had our guest last week, and a lot of that conversation was around whether information on the web is kind of making us smarter or not,
Mhm.
whether or not we should allow social media to start kind of trumping maybe traditional news media. And then prior to that, we've talked a lot about monopolies and control, how much control the tech industry should have on key industries, including the media. There was this crazy article. I thought it was a crazy article I almost didn't read it because it seemed so crazy to me, from Scientific American, where they basically make the case for the fact that these social media companies need to kind of open up their black box and start giving their data to independent researchers to help understand how to keep users safe. I started reading that, Carlos, thinking there is no freaking way that these companies will ever do that. So what a waste of an idea. But the more you read it,
Yeah.
the more it kind of convinced me, right? I mean, you're decades into this industry with very little to no regulation. There's no transparency. Zuckerberg controls 58% of Meta, right? So that's Facebook and Instagram. Twitter's private now. We've talked a lot about Elon Musk and Twitter, and there's more and more research coming out that suggests that misinformation is more engaging than other types of content. We talked about that with Jason last week. That the delivery optimization techniques that these companies use, are ad driven, maximize revenue. Right? We've talked about that. There's even some research that I did not know about till this week, where there seems to be some systematic political bias in some of these platforms, where they're focused on highlighting certain politicians and certain news sources other than others. And then the other bombshell this week was, Facebook has this oversight board, right, that's supposed to kind of make sure some of this stuff doesn't happen. And they come out after, I don't know, a year, 2 years, and basically say Facebook is still playing favorites and not treating all accounts the same, especially ones that are critical of, guess what, Facebook.
Yeah. Well, look, there's been this black box defense, right, where I can't show you how this stuff works because it's all top secret, and this is nonsense, in my opinion. There are lots of industries that over the years claim the same kind of defense, and regulators said, you know what you're doing is too important to society to be left basically inside this invisible environment. And just to give you an example, banks and loans, right? So how mortgages are made, right? Because there was so much discrimination at one time, they said, no, you have to have some level of transparency to make sure that you're giving credit in a fair way and not discriminating. Manufacturing processes used to be claimed to be top secret, and no, we have, like we had earlier this year, right? The milk, the baby milk scandal, because there are inspectors that come and check that how you're making food for people that's safe. You can't say the way I make children's milk is top secret, and so I can't let you in the plant, right? And time and again, when there has been an overriding social responsibility of a firm in a process, right? No matter how important it may be to success of the company, the needs of society to make sure that what's being done is being done correctly has usually trumped, right, this claim of you're going to harm my competitiveness. I think the same thing should be applied here. I think there's so much going on inside these platforms. They affect so much of life that not everything needs to be looked at, but there are certain things like data privacy, right? Like the way in which these recommendation engines work, that I don't think that they can't be subject to some oversight by the public. I think that the claim that it's going to harm competitiveness is just it's been done for a century, and it usually turns out to be false, and it probably would turn to be false in this particular case again.
Yeah, and we had the conversation, like I said, a couple weeks of conversations about monopolies, and I was the first one to defend these companies and say I don't think they're monopolies. I think they've made the investments, and they're providing a service that's of value, right? But then maybe this is the balance, right? That needs to happen, because it's completely I mean, for two guys, and I'm not talking two companies, two guys, right? Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg to control whatever that ends up being, 80% of the social media and all the things that happen as a result of it. There has to be something there. And then you talk about security, right? So another two states this week, banned TikTok on kind of state
Right.
devices. And they joined a longer list. I think there's 9 now, including, so now it's Utah, Alabama, Texas, Maryland, South Dakota that have made it illegal or banned the TikTok app, citing security concerns. And it's not just, at first I looked at it and said, well, are these like red states versus blue states, whatever? But even the FCC has come out and said that there's serious security threats related to TikTok. And so now you get into, okay, it's not just Zuckerberg or Musk having my data and manipulating it for advertising dollars, and should we make that unchecked? But now you have foreign entities that maybe at least seeing our data. But I don't think there's too many people that believe it's just seeing, right? There's a whole lot of things emerging now around actually rigging the algorithms to show certain content.
I think you're 100% right about that. And there's one other issue. This goes back to a conversation I had with a chief digital officer of a global tech firm, and we were talking about privacy. And he made the point that we were talking about EULAs, right? And how ridiculous it is. You get this 50-page thing that you're supposed to sign yes to, and you have no idea what's in there. And he said, look, honestly, the thing that concerns me most when I think about myself as a consumer, he goes, isn't what I can figure out today, it's what I can figure out tomorrow, for which we're collecting data today. And he made the example of, imagine if we just do a survey of employees and we ask them, what's your favorite color? So you get a survey and you say it's a survey of all our employees, right? And you answer orange. Today, that's an innocuous answer. It means nothing, right? Nothing's going to happen because you picked orange instead of yellow. But 2 years from now, we realize the AI says, hey, people who like orange are more likely to embezzle. So let's get rid of everybody who clicked orange 2 years ago, right? And so what worries me in these platforms isn't just what can be done today. It's the fact that all this data isn't being destroyed. It's being amassed, it's being warehoused. And what we can figure out today and what we can know about you today is not what we can know about you 5 years ago. And if we think back 10 years ago, right? And I would tell you that we're going to have cross-device tracking, right? The ability to see your keystrokes without you being aware of it, right? All these relationships that exist inside these machines about us that we don't even know are there. That was, and for some people, inconceivable, right? In 2010, imagine in 2030. What will be known about you because of the things that you're clicking on or typing today? And do you want that to be the case? Because right now, that's where we're headed. And we have no control, no say. And the only thing I can do is somewhat, right, disconnect from these platforms to the degree that you can. But even then, right, all visible traces are not there. We talked this before. I would love to see a browser from Apple, and I hope Apple does it, where as soon as I get to a website, a dashboard pops up and everything that's being collected about me is shown to me in a pane. Right? And everything they have about me is shown to me. So a complete, like a transparency widget, right, that I could add to Chrome, or that I could add to Safari or whatever, or an entirely new browser where you have like this privacy dashboard, this data dashboard, dials moving next to you in real time as you go to website A, website B, website C. That it hasn't happened yet to me is kind of remarkable, and I don't think it can't be done.
Well, I think Apple is positioned to do it, right? Because they're not as reliant on the advertising revenue, like the Googles and the others are, the Twitters or whatever. But I think before we went on air, we were talking about kind of some generational stuff and the expectation of privacy. I think at some point, at least for me as an individual consumer, the positives have far outweighed the negatives, right? I mean, in preparing for the show today, I was talking to somebody a bunch about TikTok, and then right before we went on, I got a bunch of alerts about TikTok news, right? So, but as scary as that is, and certainly, it's scary to my parents' generation. It was convenient because I was preparing for a show where we were going to talk about TikTok, and so it actually, was convenient for me. I think the the other challenge beyond privacy is really this idea that there could be, and we experienced some of this with the election, right? And misinformation about the election, and Russia, putting out fake information about the war in Ukraine, propaganda around Ukraine. But if there's something covert happening where a bad actor, in this case, maybe the Chinese government, is actually not just collecting information, but actually influencing people, then that is a whole nother. I mean, we talked about at one point the change from physical warfare to cyber warfare. Now you're on a whole nother, another level. You're on, mental warfare. There's a business coach that I follow a bit, and and I don't know how scientific his research was, but he did what seemed like a pretty robust experiment of all the videos that he's created on every major social media platform for several years, and TikTok, where he talks about his numbers his views and downloads going down like 100% after talking badly about the Chinese government. And he shows all these stats and all these comparisons, and so someone will have to dissect that. But if that's the kind of thing that's happening, and there's some accusations now that the algorithm may behave differently in China than it does on TikTok in the US, where it rewards kind of stupid stuff in the US, and it actually rewards innovation and that kind of positive for society kind of stuff in China.
Yeah, well, think about that. Go back to your comment about convenience, which is one that I've made and we hear all the time. And then you think back, well, what if I don't understand what this person is doing? And I use an analogy. Let's say I came to your house every day and brought you lunch for free. So every day I come with a delicious hot lunch, right? And you ask me, hey, Carlos, what do you want to charge you for that? I go, hey, Dan, we're buddies. It's free, right? It's free. Every day, a nice free lunch. What you don't know is that I put a little drop of submission juice inside the meal, okay? And that it may take a decade, but by the time you've consumed enough meals, you will do whatever I ask you to. I ask you to empty your wallet, you will. I ask you to let me walk around your house, you will. I'll ask you to drive your car whenever I feel like it, you will. Yes, it was a very convenient 10 years of free lunches. But when I'm done, to your point, right? I've trained you to like what I tell you to like, to go where I tell you to go, to buy what I tell you to buy, to tell me what I want to know about you, right? And it's not that crazy of an analogy, because that's kind of what's happened, right, with these companies. They have, by giving us a free lunch, quote unquote, whether it was email or search or some other stupid video that nobody really needs to watch, in return for that, what did we give them, right? Everything about us, the right to tell us who to vote for, the right to tell us what's news and what isn't, right? The right to tell us this is important, this isn't. The right to tell us you should follow this person and that person. The right to tell us this person is authoritative and this one isn't, right? It is one of the most ridiculously asymmetrical exchanges in the history of humanity. What they got from us is nowhere near, right, what they have given us in return.
That's a debatable point, but I would argue that the challenge is that
debatable point that I think that this side would win. You're right.
I think the problem is I was taught at a very young age, Carlos, that there's no such thing as a free lunch. So I think I would see through your.
Again, you can't even make that calculation, because all you know is what they've given you. You don't know what they've taken. This is the problem. That's why I say it's asymmetrical.
Yeah.
Right. You got free email and a search engine and whatever else you got, a browser, right? What they got in return, they refused to tell us, which goes back to the point of the article, right? Look, this was a deal. We know what we got, but what did you guys get? Isn't
and
it?
I think that's the problem is we don't know that. I don't think the average person, I mean, listen, we're in the tech business. I didn't figure this out right away either. We knew we were giving them data, but I don't think we realized the extent of which, the article I saw this morning was referencing the license agreement or the user agreement you were referring to for TikTok, where it actually says that it monitors how you swipe your finger across the screen. Right, that's a level of detail
Yeah.
that I don't think people expect. I don't think people expect an algorithm to be hacked for somebody's purpose other than just making something go by. I don't think people realize the intricacies of that the potential intricacies of an algorithm like that, versus just, hey, if you dance funny, you're gonna get a lot of views, right? It's not quite that simple. It's not quite that static, and so people don't realize the depth of what it is, to the extent that there was actually a really interesting episode of the HBO show Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, where he actually got all of this information on like people in Congress, and he was able to buy legally, and it was insane information. I mean, these are politicians. These are like
Public.
people that should have some privacy where it relates to what they do, right?
Well, look, I think it goes back to this issue of privacy. We were talking about it before we went on the air, that it strikes me when you look at certain societies that something I thought was an innate human trait, which is the need for privacy, that there is an attempt to socially engineer that out of human beings. All right, China being the best example. I think they're trying to grow a generation of citizens who will not understand what the word means, that they won't ask about it, it won't matter to them. It may take 4 or 5 generations. It's almost like Mendel and trying to create a new species of plant, right? It takes sometimes multiple generations to get the trait that you most want. But that's kind of what's happening, right? There's a kind of genetic engineering going on, so that maybe by the year you get to 2100, the average Chinese person doesn't understand what the word privacy means. Even and they're not that far off today, right? We saw this in some of the COVID examples where people, a policeman come up to you and say, "Let me see your cell phone. I want to check what you've been tweeting for the last 24 hours," and you give them the phone. I mean, to us, that seems insane, but it's not insane there. It's pretty much standard practice. If that's in 2022, what's it going to be like in 2075?
Yeah. Um,
So yeah, the tech platforms we know are complicit in this, right? They're enabling this, and once again, as a libertarian, my take is, shouldn't we just stop, just at least have this conversation, right? Is free email really worth that much? Hmm. I'll pay for
well,
email if it means, right, that like I'm not on most social platforms because of this issue. I don't trust them. And I don't know what they're going to do with this information, not today, but in 5 years from now, right? And I don't let my kids go on them for the most part. So what do you do, right? I think that's the interesting question. As a society, we just haven't had that. The Europeans are having that conversation much more than we are. We just say, well, okay, I like the free email.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and we like the free we like the free content, and we like the free news, right? So the other part of this conversation, which relates back also to the Jason Steinhauser conversation we had, is this legislation, which apparently is not new, but it's come back in a new and updated form. It's called the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, and it's actually got bipartisan support. And so the idea is to allow the smaller media companies who are really getting kind of killed by, I guess, the democratization of content and news and things, to basically be able to use sort of an arbitration type of negotiation, almost like they use in Major League Baseball, to allow publishers to monetize their content, which is an interesting idea as we talk about what content is true and not versus not true, and what content is supported by ad revenue versus traditional media. This is federal legislation, and the supporters at least are arguing that it's necessary, right? Because these news outlets, particularly the local ones who've lost significant revenue, while the big online tech companies have increase their ad revenues, they need this, right? And they also part of the bill, in addition to this kind of regulated negotiation, also allows for an exemption from some of the antitrust laws, which we've talked a lot about the antitrust stuff over the last few weeks. So what's your thought, Carlos?
Well, I think this is the damage in media has, for the large part, been done. I follow this industry very closely, and it has never recovered, right, from the impact of companies like Google. And even today, if you look at Apple News, for example, which is a very nice product, but what does Apple News do? Right, Apple News presents news that other people have created, right? You're getting a subscription price, right? And it's not their content, right? It is they've made deals with people who are the creators to be able to present the content for them. What the split is between the creator, right, and Apple is another story. And I don't know what that is. But the reality is the fact that these platforms, as they become aggregators, have become dominant forces, and they've damaged journalism. So anything that tries to, I think it's too late. If you're trying to save the old model, the only way it will be to create some new form of what it means to be journalist, and then to protect it, right? The fact that you can be found, to give an example, right? Google never asked anyone for permission to be found on Google. Last time I checked, they never sent me a thing saying, you know what, you've got 3 websites. Is it okay if we index you, right, and present you? And the same thing happened to these news creators, right? So suddenly they're being shown, and pages are being cached with their content that they never agreed to. So I think, okay, it's probably too late to save the traditional media models from everything that I read on a daily basis. But if it helps buy time for a new generation, right, model, especially in local markets, which are the ones that have been the most devastated, then it's probably a useful thing to at least consider.
Yeah, it's
Back to asymmetry, right, Dan? It's such an unlevel playing field. A small paper of 50 people against Google.
Well, what's kind of crazy about it is, well, I guess that's the real question. You bring up, I think your question is the right question, right? Is it too late? Is this really going to work, or is this just a way of kind of slowing down the
Right.
and of course the tech industry, the social media industry is pushing back, right? I mean, Google claims that they've funded a bunch of different programs to support local news outlets, to the extent that they're paying more than $1 billion a year to license content for a new Google News product, which, by the way, has launched abroad and has not launched in the US
Yeah,
yet.
but that's like the town bully who talks about how many bandages he donates, right? So, okay, great. Nobody buys more band-aids than me in this town. Yeah, because nobody puts more people in the hospital than you do. So that's that's a smokescreen. Come on, all right?
Uh,
If you hadn't done any damage, you wouldn't have to pay this $1 billion in subsidies. You're paying that, which is a fraction of the damage that's been done, right, to media all over the world, because it needs the help because of what you did. Right. So again, this is these are oligopolies protecting themselves with what are pretty much tired arguments. And but up to now, again, right, we go back to this remarkable thing that the quote unquote convenience factor for the average consumer has overweighed kind of everything. I think it's myopic thinking. I understand it because I do the same thing sometimes, especially with Amazon, right? Uh, but it is in the long term, the troubling thing is my final point is that the more research is done, the worse the picture becomes. Right? It isn't like every time there's a new paper from Chicago or Stanford, we get a little less worried. No. the more research that is published about how these platforms work, the more worried most of us get who follow these discussions, and that's not a good trend.
But I would also say, if if the platforms pull out, so you know, and I'm sure it's just posturing, right? But Facebook is basically said, you know, hey, we've also paid couple $100,000 a year in licensing fees, which is a drop in the bucket, I guess, right? But you know, to these firms, and if this legislation passes, we'll just pull news from Facebook, right? So is that better though, Carlos, in a world where you know I think it's a love-hate relationship. I mean, you even said one of the reasons why a lot of these publications are afraid to go up against Twitter is that they rely on Twitter for traffic now. It's not like you're getting you know, that the paper delivered to your house the way you used to be.
No, you're exactly right. And maybe that's an issue around the quality, right, of the content itself. Sure, if your content isn't worth anything, then no, you're in big trouble, and it's easy for someone who puts out bad content to complain about Google. But as we know, the when you put out good content, right, it's just like the people who create new brands where you think, wow, how could anybody launch a sneaker brand or a shoe brand when there's all these big monsters, and yet along comes an Allbirds, somebody else, and does something innovative, and there you go, right? So I just think that it's about leveling the playing field. Give the people who are producing good content at a small scale space to grow. Right now, the models suffocate them for the
Yeah.
most part. It's just not fair.
And for what it's worth, it's happening elsewhere, right? So the U.S. is the most recent, but there's all kinds of regulation. You mentioned Europe before. Canada said this week it's introducing legislation to require digital platforms to make fair commercial deals with publishers. European Union did it in 2019, or at least a copyright law.
They're headed in that
more
direction
ago.
now, right? There's now more conversations about compensating the news sources, which hasn't been the case there, but I think that's the direction that they're headed.
Yeah, Australia also has a similar law, so it seems like it's going in that direction. We shall see. You know, I suspect that the tech firms are just posturing more than anything else, right? If at the end of the day, if the news brings in advertisers, then why would they not be in that business?
I agree. Mhm.
Carlos, good talking to you as always.
Wow,
And
by
for
the time
those,
you get Dan, there you go. There goes our hour, 45 minutes.
yeah, it goes quickly as always. This year's gone quickly, Carlos. As I was looking at some of the episodes we've done, like I said, we'll be off for the next couple weeks. This is our last show of 2020-22, but you know, all of the recordings are available on LinkedIn and YouTube, and the audio is on our podcast platform. If you're planning research projects for next year, we're here to help. We're powered by a network of over 130,000 executives. Let us know what you're working on, how we can help. And in the meantime, we'll see you not next Wednesday, January 4th at noon Eastern. Carlos, have a great holiday. Have a great holiday, everybody. And we'll see you in the new year.
Thanks to everyone who's watching or listening. Happy holidays to all of you, and happy holidays to you and your family again. We'll see you next year.